Hello, everybody. Good to see you here. As I've told people before, I'm not great at extemporaneous speaking, so I always have to have notes. In fact, right here it says, glad you're all here. I did remember that. My name is Mike Fleming, and I'm the chair of our Green Sanctuary Council. Our church is committed to the principles of Unitarian Universalism, one of which is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Following that principle, 3 years ago, we became the first solar-powered church in New Hampshire. As a church, we don't endorse political candidates, but we feel privileged to host a series of events addressing the crucial problem of climate change. So, these forums are intended to be educational for New Hampshire voters and raise the level of discourse on the topic of climate in the 2020 presidential campaign. To achieve that, we encourage both the panel who are here and the audience to ask hard questions later on. However, these forums are the opposite of an internet chat room or Twitter. This is our church, a safe space for everyone, and we ask you to listen with your minds and your hearts and to be respectful of one another, even when we have strong differences. So, the hardest climate question is a moral one. What kind of world are we going to leave for our children? So, if we're serious about this, really 5 things we need to make sure of with any climate policy. First, it has to be effective. It can't just be window dressing. It really has to work. Second of all, it has to be fair. It can't increase the divisions of our country any worse than they already are. It needs to be economically feasible. We can't tank the economy while saving the environment. It also has to be fast, because we know that every year that we delay, it's going to get worse. And probably the hardest thing is it's got to be one has solutions that really last. They have to last for at least 20 presidential campaigns through this century and beyond that. So we need to develop consensuses. And there's going to be many party changes, so we have to pay attention to everybody's opinions. The agenda for tonight. First, Governor Weld will present his policy proposals to address the climate crisis. Then there will be 5 minutes each for a special panel to ask Governor Weld a question and for him to answer. And then there'll be 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience, and we'll end at 7:30. So there are thanks that are due. Obviously, thanks to Governor Weld and to his staff. There's a couple of them here. Thank you very much for all your work. I want to thank our select panel here, but I'll talk about them a little bit later. And I also want to give a hand to all the young people who are here helping tonight, because, of course, it's the fate of their planet that's in danger right now. Can we give a hand? Thank you all. So I've cobbled together some bullet points in Governor Weld's biography from his website, from Wikipedia and elsewhere. And apologies if I've gotten anything wrong, Governor, but I'm just going to give it a shot.
Probably approved.
He is a Harvard and Oxford graduate. In fact, one of his ancestors graduated from Harvard class in 1650. Governor Weld began his career as the legal counsel for the U.S. House Committee on the Judiciary, where he participated in the Watergate case. He later became U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, where he won 109 convictions in 111 cases of public corruption. He served 7 years in the U.S. Justice Department as Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division. As part of that, he worked there on high-profile public corruption cases, and later resigned in protest of an ethics scandal involving Attorney General Edward Meese. In 1997, Bill Weld was elected governor of Massachusetts, and he served 2 terms. He was the first Republican to be elected governor of Massachusetts in 20 years, and he was ranked the most fiscally conservative governor in the country. When he was governor, Bill Weld led 16 official trade missions to Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. He's got a long resume, so I'll continue. He was the 2016 vice presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party, running on a platform that included statements that were supportive of LGBT rights. That platform was also relatively hands-off with regard to environmental issues and said, government has a terrible track record when it comes to environmental protection. He is now an active member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has traveled extensively throughout Asia, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and North and South America. He serves as an associate member of the Interaction Council, which is a group of former world leaders, world heads of state, which considers reports on issues such as nuclear proliferation, religious sectarianism, natural resources, energy, food, and water. In an interview with Boston.com, Governor Weld has said that there's a pressing need to act on climate change and that the country should rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. He's also said that the current administration's approach to climate change is antithetical to every principle of conservation and conservatism and every tenet of Theodore Roosevelt's grand old plan. I'd like us to give a great welcome, a warm welcome to Governor Weld.
Thank you very much, everybody. I was chatting earlier with John, one of the panelists to my right, and I said, you know, I'm doing this partly because I think Donald Trump poses an existential threat to our democratic institutions and our system of government. So that's an overriding issue. On the other hand, climate change poses an existential threat to our planet, which is even more important than Donald J. Trump. So my first couple of issues that I will challenge, take on, if getting to Washington in charge of the executive branch. Number one, no more trillion-dollar deficits, and I know how to do that. I did it in Massachusetts. That's why I was ranked the most fiscally conservative governor. You just have to not have any sacred cows and measure outcomes from last year instead of inputs. Input is last year's appropriation, and in Washington they think anything other than an input plus 10% is a cut. And so what you have to do instead is look at how the program operated, and if it was, say, a preventive health program that led to a lot of good health outcomes and saved a lot of unnecessary medical expenditures, you might multiply that budget item by a factor of 10. But if it's a bureaucracy that nobody can really understand quite what it's doing, that might go to zero, and that's how I did it in Massachusetts. And you could do that in the federal government. I've never met a layer of government that couldn't stand some trimming. In terms of climate change, as well as the fiscal trillion-dollar deficits, I argue that these are unfair generationally to the millennials, the Gen Xers, everyone else who's going to wind up paying these bills. My generation is not going to pay the bills for either climate change or the trillion-dollar deficits. It's going to be the millennials and the younger voters. And the millennials are now the largest voting bloc, so I'm hoping to be able to get their attention, and if they come out and vote in great numbers, I think I could win not just the New Hampshire primary, but a whole lot of other primaries, because they're now the largest voting bloc in the United States. So the difference between my climate change proposals and those of other candidates that I've seen, notably the Democrats, is that they do tend to cast their proposals in terms of inputs. I remember Tom Steyer's had just three parts to it. One was $1 trillion here, another was $200 billion there, and the third was, $100 billion, which is chicken feed, for a third climate desirable program. But as I say, I don't think measuring inputs is the way to get to these intractable problems, such as the budget, and also how to solve the climate change, how to address the climate change issue. So what we've got to do is propose something based on outcomes. And the goal of climate change is to prevent temperature from rising between now and 2050 by the predicted 3 degrees that scientists generally think that it's going to happen, and that would be a disaster. The polar ice cap would melt, all the mountain glaciers in the world would melt, there would be no snow on the White Mountains, they wouldn't be white anymore, the seacoast of New Hampshire and every other state on either seacoast would be completely rearranged, and that's just for openers, and that's a scientific consensus. So just a little bit of background, which has some technical stuff in it, but just to set the table for my precise proposal. So the human activities that are most impactful on climate change are emissions, which is through fuel combustion, aerosol releases, cement manufacture. Also land use, deforestation is very deleterious. It lies in my mind that one of the things we can do as we get down the road is to buy up the sovereign debt of places like Brazil and Bolivia that have huge amounts of rainforests and stipulate as a condition that they be preserved in their natural state. That's a form of aggressive afforestation, which is very good for this problem. Animal husbandry of cattle and other ruminant types who chew grasses is also a contributor. We are the second largest carbon emitter, we the U.S., behind China. We're the largest on a per capita basis, and we account for 14–15% of global carbon emissions. Methane and other greenhouse gases also contribute to climate change. I noticed Mr. Trump last week said we really need to have more methane. So I, Mr. Trump, am going to relax the strictures on the release of methane from dumps and mines and other. Methane actually is 38 times as bad as CO2 in terms of impact on the atmosphere. So the man has a genius for going to exactly the wrong point and then doubling down. Current modeling, as I said, suggests that the temperature is going to rise 3 degrees by 2050 if nothing is done. There's a good many people who think we're already at 1.3 degrees above the base case on our way to 3 degrees. And increases in temperature don't so much show up on a day-to-day basis. The trapped solar and other heat-based energy typically leads, however, to increased weather variability and storm intensity, and we've seen a lot of that already recently. There will probably arise soon a host of low probability, high cost climate events such as the melting of the polar ice sheets, the reversing or disruption of the Gulf Stream, and the sudden and substantial release of potent greenhouse gas emissions from Arctic permafrost or offshore methane hydrates. And under a lot of business as usual scenarios, which means doing nothing, many pre-industrial nations, that's those who have not yet tasted the benefits of the Industrial Revolution, will not be able to support their present human populations. There's going to be water supply disruptions, agricultural losses, and generally inhospitable living conditions. So those countries will be wiped out. And I suggest there's a moral issue if we say to the South, which I use that phrase to describe the lesser developed nations, if we say to them, we've had the benefits of the Industrial Revolution, but you don't get to eat any ice cream or have any benefits, and we're going to keep everything we've got. That would not be the attitude to rejoin the Paris Accords with. So taken together, these things become a threat multiplier, and they have impacts on national security and political instability. And it's not always realized that climate change is a national security issue for the United States. Just to give you one tiny example, the Defense Department of the United States reached a determination earlier this year that of its 79 mission-critical installations worldwide, majority faced climate-induced risks, and over the next 20 years that's going to be flooding, drought, and wildfires. And just last year, DoD installations sustained $8 billion in damages from extreme weather, even without any of the bad things that business as usual would produce. So I would immediately, upon election, upon inauguration, rejoin the Paris Accords. I would also align OPIC and Exim Bank with the World Bank, which already no longer finances coal-fired power plants. So have that be true for OPIC and Exim Bank as well. Revisit the U.S.-China agreements of 2014 on carbon mitigation to prohibit export subsidies for coal, especially in Belt and Road countries with China's new initiative there. And I would support adoption of Paul Kagali's amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which would reach hydrofluorocarbons, which are very potent greenhouse gases, and extend this beyond just CO2. So that's setting the table for what we're going to do. What I suggest is the clearest, simplest method, and others on this sitting here I think may concur, is to put a price on carbon, and the price would be imposed upstream where the carbon enters the economy. So that would be at the wellhead for oil, at the mine shaft for mining, at the import terminal for LNG. LNG is C4, it's all carbon all the time. And so that's where the price would be imposed. And so those folks would bear the lion's share of paying the price at the outset. But so there has to be a price per ton, and the discussion thus far has reached all the way from the Trump administration says $5 a ton. Many people think $50 a ton. A sort of consensus price would be $40 a ton, but you don't have to start out with $40 a ton. You could start out with something $18 or $20, and then as the market adjusts to the price mechanism, that price would rise until it got to an equilibrium point, which many people think would be around $40 a ton. It's worth pointing out that whatever the cost of such a mechanism, such a scheme would be, it would pale in comparison to the cost imposed by the Democratic proposals that have been floated. For example, Senator Sanders' proposal, the senator from Vermont, would be equivalent to proposing a price of $250 per ton. Vice President Biden's proposal, which is the Obama Clean Power Plant, was equivalent to costing $153 to $163 per ton. And if you let the market determine the price, you can, as I said, start with a price as low as in the teens and have it float up to probably equilibrium around $40 a ton. So why is this not a tax? It's not a tax because the money would not be kept by the government, and the amount of money that would be collected at $50 a ton would be about $200 billion a year, and the federal government today collects only $36 billion in fuel excise taxes, which is $26 billion from gasoline and $10 billion from diesel and specialized fuels. So you could abolish those taxes. And as someone who's been in a number of statewide races and one federal race for the Senate, I can tell you, average voters just hate the gasoline tax. They really, really hate it. So that the idea is if you abolish those taxes at the same time that you're imposing the price on carbon, that might make the medicine go down. And you have to think about the limits of the possible. That's politics after all. And that might be able to achieve success in getting the measure passed. The other thing that distinguishes my proposal from the others, the Democrats, the ones that are out there, is I don't think any of them espouse maintenance of nuclear power. And I see nuclear by 2040, 50 being 25% of the grid in this country. You know, people are snake bit by Fukushima. Fukushima was a ginormous plant built on top of a barrier reef. It's the most foolhardy thing in environmental history. So we don't have to worry about that. We could look to the example of other countries that have, I can think of one European country that is in the 80s adopted small nuclear plants for 75% of their entire grid, and they've had nothing approaching an accident. I know a lot of rural counties in New York State, for example, that would welcome another nuclear plant. They already have them, and they know they're a very good neighbor and a good employer. The other thing is that I personally think that natural gas, which as recently as 5-7 years ago was a darling of environmentalists because it wasn't coal or oil, and is now a terrible bugbear for environmentalists because it is a fossil fuel. I think we may have to live with natural gas for a while during this transition period to getting where we need to be. But that's my proposal, and it's quite different than every proposal from any of the Democratic presidential candidates. And I assure you it's even more different than Mr. Trump's proposal, which would be doing nothing at all. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I think this turned off.
It's on. It's on. It's on.
It's on? It just doesn't light now. So, I want to thank Governor Weld, and now it's time for our questions from our special panel. All of them have long-standing concern and expertise related to climate change. They're part of this panel because they are special people. Each panelist has 5 minutes to expand and correct anything I've said wrong about their introduction biographies, which I'm going to be doing, and then ask Governor Weld a question about his proposed policies with regard to climate change. Let's start on the right. You good? Okay with that? Okay. Again, I have to look at my notes. This is Karen Weston. If you don't know her, she's a governor of Dover, New Hampshire. Governor? Sorry, I'm saying governor too often. Not governor yet. She's the mayor of Dover. And Dover is the 4th largest city in New Hampshire, for those of you who don't know that. And she's seeking a 4th term as mayor after serving 6 years as a city councilor. Her priorities as mayor have been continued commercial development and economic growth, fiscal discipline, and waterfront development. Karen's roots run deep in Dover and in New Hampshire. She graduated from Dover High and from Keene State College. She's also a small business owner. Dover is the location of several significant installations of solar power buildings, including the Children's Museum of New Hampshire and the new Dover High School. Mayor Weston led the charge recently this year in getting 13 New Hampshire mayors to sign on in support of legislation for clean, renewable energy. So, can you please ask your question?
Sure. This is Governor Karen. Governor, you've made my question change about 4 times during listening to you. And for me, the environment is essential for our future, as you stated. And Dover has been very proactive and for renewable energy. The 13 mayors that we were able to get signed on was for SB 365 and HB 165, which were renewable energy, and it's clean. So doing some research, and anybody that knows me, I always do my research, everything has to be through collaboration. You can't have one entity promote something, and if everybody else doesn't join in, then it's not going to work. And just yesterday, I had a very far-right winged person state to me, we were talking about climate change, I was telling him I was coming here this evening, and what he said was, I don't believe in climate change. Number one, I hope that if you become president, you will go and have some kind of education program, because education is essential in trying to convince people what climate change really is. And so this one question is a multitude of questions. It's not only environment, it's the making of our environment. And again, it's China, Russia, Mongolia, Iran, Mexico City, Bangladesh, Iran, India, Pakistan are the 10 top smog cities of the world. That smog has an impact on our environment, which causes global warming. And my concern is, how do you plan on getting not just one certain group of countries together, because we need to have a collaboration with all countries to work together for our future, for our environment, because if not, I think you're right, we're going to be okay. But it's going to be our kids, our grandkids, and our great-grandkids. So what are you going to be able to do to have that collaboration from all countries around the world?
Well, the toughest part is going to be China, which is tremendously dependent on coal. I spend a fair amount of time, actually a few years ago I was spending 2 months a year in Mongolia, and within 80 kilometers of the Chinese border, so I'm familiar with the type of industrial activity they have just on the northern border of China. It's all coal, all the way out to the western part of the country. So that's going to be the toughest nut to crack, and it's a matter of negotiation. But China right now is spending 3 times as much annually on clean energy as we are. So they're the global leader on that right now, because we've fallen behind. So it's not like they're unaware of the problem here. When they had the Beijing Olympics recently, I was in Beijing shortly before the Olympics, and I couldn't see across the street. The sky was so red. It wasn't dark, it was just red. And I was staying at Hotel X, and the new Hyatt Hotel was across the street. I couldn't see it, and it just was like red fumes everywhere. And then suddenly, 2-3 weeks before the Olympics, the head person blew a whistle, and all industrial activity within X miles of the site of the Olympics ceased. And those of you who watched the Olympics know that it had pristine, pure air, and everything looked beautiful, and they were a tremendous success. And 48 hours after the Olympics, another whistle was blown. My point being is that they are truly command and control economy and a command and control country, and properly motivated, they can make things happen very, very quickly. And I say that against the following backdrop. I had high hopes for Xi Jinping when he came in, because his family was in the government of Guangdong province, which is the southernmost province, and the first one to move in the direction of a market economy. So that's where he started out. He didn't start out as a Maoist, and the guy he beat for the top spot, Bo Xilai, was a terrible Maoist and cult of personality guy. However, since my beau ideal Xi Jinping got into power, he's kind of backslid on items such as subsidies for the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, and China is now beating our brains in Africa and South America and around the world by building all the railroads and schools and hospitals for free, and all they want in exchange is a 15-year take-or-pay contract for all the cobalt, magnesium, rhenium essential for jet engines, speaking of national security, and we're losing that fight. So that's going to be the toughest nut in the negotiations following the United States' rejoining of the Paris Accords. But, early on, Xi Jinping said, we in the United States have 1,000 reasons to be friends. And I think that's correct. And what he meant was we have many, many touch points. And we really do. And we're the 2 largest economies, and you could argue by, by which measure and at what point China will become #1. It doesn't really matter. We're the top two, and Russia is not a third world country, but compared to us, but not really in the same league. So that's a bilateral negotiation, but I suggest it can be multipolar, and there's all kinds of things that China wants from us other than how much carbon they have to reduce their emissions by. So I would use those other negotiating points, touch points, to create the leverage on China to get them down. After that, the rest of the post-rejoining Paris Accords is relatively easy.
Thank you. Any follow-up question? Actually, we don't have time for that. I mean,
Just one
serious.
But what about those other countries that I listed, the Mongolians, the Iranians, the Indians, Pakistan? If they continue to be negative, what are you going to be able to do to reach out to them, even though they're not China? They're all adding to the unhealthy environment.
No, they are, but as I say, I spent a lot of time in Mongolia. They would be thrilled to get their power from wind instead of coal. And they have a huge amount of wind, which comes in from the northwest and just goes right through the country down into China. So, for example, we could offer them technical expertise to grow their wind industry. That's just one example I happen to know a lot about. Don't know quite so much about what we would offer to Iran, as I haven't spent a lot of time in Tehran. But India has plenty of things that it needs from the United States, and I'm not saying we should be the only person pushing the engine uphill. Other people have to pull their weight as well. But so far, only the United States has been a scofflaw and said we're getting out of here altogether. So there's a lot of goodwill, certainly a lot of goodwill in Europe and the NATO countries, most of the NATO countries, for this. So I look for my leverage where I could find it and not raise my hand and say we're going to be the only sole actor. But we got to set an example.
The next question will be from Roger Stevenson, who's taking the role of environmental scientist. He's the Northeast Regional Advocacy Director for the Climate and Energy Program of the Union of Concerned Scientists. He's got 25 years of experience working with business, government, and nonprofit executives. He served as a special assistant to the Secretary of the Interior and in the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He also served as the National Field Director for the League of Conservation Voters and was its Executive Director of its Education Fund. In addition, he's been a Senior Advisor for the Environmental Defense Fund and Vice President for Programs at Clean Air, Cool Planet. He's co-authored a book called On Strategies to Accelerate Climate and Energy Action at the Local Level. Mr. Stevenson earned a BA in Zoology and an MS in Wildlife Biology from the University of New Hampshire. Roger.
Thank you, Michael. Governor, thank you for coming to New Hampshire. There are several elements that the next administration needs to attend to with respect to reducing emissions. First, the price on carbon. How we spend that money is one of the issues that I think will be discussed between the administration and Congress as we move forward. The next is acceleration of renewable energy, the renewable energy standard, having a national renewable energy standard, and also accelerating clean transportation. Doing all of this, and as Michael said, doing it in a way that is equitable and just is a priority. And last, we need an administration that commits to robust research and innovation so that we can bring new technologies into the market. A number of conservatives agree that there should be a price on carbon. Jerry Taylor, now at the Niskanen Institute, but a former Cato executive, makes a case for a conservative case for a price on carbon. Doug Holtz-Eakin was at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He was a senior economic and climate advisor to Senator McCain, and he was in charge of the Congressional Budget Office. He also thinks that there should be a price on carbon and the dividend of the dollars returned to the American people. Art Laffer in 2011 spoke to a room full of conservatives here in New Hampshire and told them that a carbon tax should be a part of national tax reform. Now, Governor, a supporter of yours remarked that you view conservation as an inherent value for the country. And you say you're going to bring the country back into the Paris Agreement. I think, based on what I heard, I wanted to realign my question a little bit with respect to the price on carbon. If you put that at the wellhead, which many economists agree is the most efficient way to do, would you apply that price on carbon to the border? That is, products and services that come into the United States from other countries. And do you think that that would have a positive, what effect might that have on emissions in other parts of the country?
So taking the last question first, I think the majority views that a border adjustment fee might be a salutary way to approach it. In terms of conservatives who've signed on here, the granddaddy of the type of approach I'm suggesting was a plan rolled out a number of years ago by George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, and James A. Baker, the former Secretary, also Secretary of State and of the Treasury. And they proposed to return the money from the price on carbon to individual households on a per capita basis. I don't know. I still like the idea of abolishing the gasoline tax because it was put in there in the first place in order to attack carbon. So you could argue that it's no longer necessary once you attack carbon directly through the price on carbon. And as the stats I quoted earlier suggest, collecting $200 billion a year from the price on carbon, you'd have a lot of money left over after the $36 billion that you would pay to delete both the tax on gasoline and the tax on diesel. And you could, for example, use that and apply it to the payroll tax for low-income people only. Because another thing that if I get in there, I'd be doing with my left hand while my right hand was directly attacking climate change, is also attacking income inequality. And there's a major, and the carbon price is somewhat regressive if unameliorated. So doing something for lower income folks at the same time, I think might also enhance passage. There are various kinds of regulations that you could do away with that are aimed right at carbon to get Republican votes. I think the income inequality with the left hand might help get Democratic votes. And as you suggest, there's a respectable pedigree here. After Baker Schultz, there was a 2019 comprehensive proposal by a Republican from Florida, Francis Rooney, and a very interesting proposal by Carlos Curvelo, a great congressman from the Miami area who lost his seat, unfortunately, in 2018. But those are all Republican plans. And man bites dog. The most creative proposals here might come from Republicans.
Thank you. Our next panelist here represents the faith community in our area. Her name is Sylvia Foster, and she's active in our local group called the Seacoast Interfaith Stewards of the Earth. A bunch of churches here belong to that. She's also a member of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Exeter in New Hampshire, and leads a green team at that church. She also co-edits a newsletter called Active Hope, which reports on positive change, including programs that work to slow climate change. She's active in 350 New Hampshire and has a BS and MS from the University of Maine. She works as the Education Program Director at the University of New Hampshire with the Schools Commission on the Status of People of Color, People with Disabilities, Women, and LGBTQ. Sylvia.
Thank you for being here. As a representative of the interfaith community, I can safely say that we all look forward to the next administration putting the EPA back to work and NOAA being able to say climate change. I think we all look forward to seeing more people involved in local work to change local climate conditions. But as far as today's legislative inner workings, it seems that it's mostly people of privilege all around who ironically get all the rebates and tax breaks on purchases of renewables and electric cars and such. I think we need more inspired citizens involved in stemming this tide of climate change. So as president, and I already heard you say a break around carbon usage, what other incentives would you offer to people of different income brackets, and especially to low-income citizens, in order to create equity and inclusion in this effort to lower our footprints?
Well, let me just quote one sentence I didn't give you when I went through my presentation earlier. After reciting the parade of horribles at the beginning, I have written the following sentence: given these scientific and societal realities, our obligation to act is moral as we exercise our sacred stewardship of God's precious creation and ensure prudent protection of our fragile ecosystem. So I'm kind of there in principle. I also want to say that while libertarians are mezzo on environmental enforcement and protection, I'm not. And just as I always had a crow to pick with the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, on social issues such as LGBTQ, gay marriage, reproductive rights, I was always front and center out there on the welcoming, open, accepting side of those issues. So too did I have a crow to pick for the libertarians on environmental. And I can remember going to the annual meeting of the Cato Institute, which I did every year when I was in office, and having huge fights with Ed Crane and David Bowes about just that issue. And to me, it's so obvious that that's an exception from my general libertarian approach to things, because the economies of scale in dealing with the environment, let alone climate, are so enormous. You cannot rely on an individual or a business to amass the capital and devote the capital necessary to have an impact there. That has to be the government. That's by way of background. So in terms of how else would I address the income inequality or the low income, I think I did say that I kind of favor abolishing the existing tax on diesel and on gasoline, because it's it's in pari materia. It's the same type of thing as what the itch that we're scratching with the price on carbon, and people would love it. I'm not sure that it's the least regressive thing in the world, but it would be politically very popular. But that's why I said, after you apply $36 billion out of the $200 billion to that, then how about payroll tax relief for lower income people? And that goes directly at your question. And anytime there's $200 billion that we know is going to be regurgitated to citizens, there's going to be a huge fight in Congress. But as I say, I think giving the money directly to tax relief for lower income people, by the way, that's something I want to do anyway, in just attacking income inequality. I don't know what the numbers are yet, but I would certainly propose tax relief of X% for the bottom Y percent of the population. It might be 15% tax relief for the bottom 20%. It might be 20% tax relief for the bottom 15%. And obviously, the lower down you get on the economic ladder, the less the tax relief. $1 of tax credit is worth less for somebody not making that much money than it is for a rich corporation who every day they buy and sell these huge tax credits from low-income housing, for example. So it might be that something like dramatically escalating the earned income tax credit, which I did my first year as governor, which goes right at the working poor. It's almost like the negative income tax that George McGovern campaigned on in 1972 and was universally ridiculed for. But I'm here to say that maybe it's just that President Trump has succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in setting everybody's teeth on edge in this country and stirring up the pot and getting people all either resentful or fearful of what others are going to do. But I do sense potential fraying or even an actual fraying of social cohesion in the country, which is why I go around saying, hey, we're the United States of America, remember? And Leslie, my wife, and I were at an event, a Republican event recently where everyone, we gave the Pledge of Allegiance, ending in one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And then we listened to a whole bunch of speeches from red meat Republicans saying, we really have to just stick it to these Democrats. There's no such thing as a good Democrat. If you vote for a good Democrat, you're empowering a crazy Democrat who will get elected speaker. That's no way to talk. I think the social cohesion point is very important and would address it either directly or indirectly. And I choose the payroll tax, but it may be some more direct form of monetary relief. My nightmare is the door to the middle class being slammed in the face of the working poor.
Thank you.
Thank you both. So our next and final panelist is John Gage. He represents the environmental advocate role in this panel. He has a Bachelor of Science in biology from Boston College, 35 years career experience in enterprise integration systems at Sun Microsystems and then at Oracle. He's joined Citizen Climate Lobby 3 years ago and transitioned from working at Oracle to being a full-time volunteer position with CCL to help get carbon fee and dividend legislation passed by Congress. He co-founded the CCL New Hampshire South Central chapter and helped start 2 newer chapters. He's the CCL New Hampshire State Coordinator, and now that has over 1,200 volunteers across the state. He also speaks at schools and other events about climate science and carbon pricing. John.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Governor Weld, for spending the evening with us. Well, I've got to say, I love all this talk about carbon pricing. We don't hear enough about the most effective way to reduce emissions, and it takes talking about it before people will be able to understand just how beneficial and powerful it is. Economists say the cheapest way to reduce pollution is to put a price on it. You let efficient market forces reduce pollution by incentivizing solutions that don't pollute. So the IPCC economists and Nicholas Stern and the High Commission on Carbon Pricing estimates we need a carbon price of between $40 and $80 per ton by 2020 and $50 to $100 per ton by 2030 to meet the Paris emission reduction targets, to meet the temperature targets that was set in the Paris Accord, and steadily rising afterwards. Citizens Climate Lobby has a simple policy, and it's a steadily increasing fee on the production of fossil fuels based on the greenhouse gas emissions, starting at $15 a ton and rising by $10 or $15 a ton every year until emissions are down to 10% of 2017 levels. It should take about 30 years. All of the money collected will get returned back to American households on an equal basis each month. So this is a dividend. What you do with the money matters to citizens, of course, because when we raise the price of fossil fuels, a lot of things are going to get more expensive. And the question of whether to spend that money or to return it through a tax swap or as a direct dividend, a check, or a direct deposit to consumers is what we should be talking about. This is the important part of solving climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions are the problem, and this is the efficient way to reduce them. So the science is clear. The economics are clear, and there's policy options on the table that both parties can support. Governor Wood, my question though is about the roadblock, which is the politics. We've known for 30 years that we have a problem, and in that time we've doubled the cumulative emissions that we put in the atmosphere. And last year, with the US and the world made a new record of the amount of greenhouse gases we put in the air. So when you're president, what political path do you see to pass effective climate legislation?
Well, I'm encouraged by the research that I've seen suggests that $50 a ton, unlike 80 and higher that you mentioned, was that a British Royal Commission or was that a US study?
The World Bank, I believe.
World Bank,
was during
okay.
the High Commission on Carbon.
My best information is that $50 a ton, which I wouldn't even start with 50, I'd start lower and let as the market reacts to the pricing mechanism, that price is going to go up, and equilibrium might be 40, it might be 50, but 50, according to my figures, would reduce emissions by 39% to 46%. That's below 2005 levels. And that would be ahead of the Paris Accord aim, which is 26 to 28% by 2025. In both cases, by 2025. So I think we get there. In terms of the politics, I think you can tell by the stuff I said earlier. I'm already thinking about the politics. I want the payroll tax relief for lower income for Democratic votes. I want the abolishing the tax on diesel and gasoline for everybody, for motorists who are going to be heard from here. But it could be something else, and that's something that would work itself out in Congress. I think it's possible that there would be other regulatory regimes which are aimed at carbon that you wouldn't need after the pricing mechanism goes in, if you can guarantee it's going to stick. And that would be appealing to Republicans as well. And I think you can get the Democratic support you need because A, they agree with the underlying need to do this. And I hate to say it's the Republican votes you got to buy, but if the Dems do as well in next year's elections as I think they're going to, you might not need to buy too many Republican votes. And I think the way to get them is on the just abolition of taxes or reducing of taxes and possible deregulation where it really wouldn't hurt. One of the things I meant to respond to Roger's point, I think it was your point, about a lot of more research in this area. You could just be so helpful if you could devise a solution to the problem of carbon capture and sequestration. I myself think that's going to be solved, and I think it's going to be solved by putting this stuff in the bottom of the ocean. I'm not a scientist, so I can't prove that, but I'm going to follow the headlines and the research in this area. So there are breakthroughs that could happen in the research, the technical area, that would have a huge ameliorative effect on this back and forth process. But so anyway, that's my response to how I would handle the politics. I don't know what the end game would be because it depends on what 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate think. But I think you got plenty to work with.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to all of you. We now have an open time for questions from the audience. I'd like people who are interested in asking a question to come up to the center aisle, and I'll give you the microphone. Give your name and say where you're from, and kind of going on from what I said earlier, please be respectful. No gotcha questions or long speeches. We're not here to score points, but to understand Governor Weld's views on how to respond to the climate crisis. Be short and to the point so that others can have the chance. And please limit your questions to ones that have to do with climate policy. So, who would like to be first?
However, you don't have to be respectful to me. I'm a courtroom lawyer for a long time.
Okay, so I have a two-point question, and Mike, I swear it does have to do with climate change. So the first question is, do you believe in separation of church and state?
Well, yes, I do. Yeah, I do.
Okay, so as you know, there's a strong group of rising Christian conservatives in our country, and their ideology is influencing policy. So my question is, how will you manage this? And also, how will you ask them to vote for you without compromising your ideas? And so just some examples of how we're seeing this is, I mentioned to you earlier, the global gag rule on abortion, which you said you would overturn. The transgender rights in the military, which you said you would overturn. But also there's a movement to teach creationism as science, and that's happening in southern states right now in public schools.
Right.
So
Yeah,
how will you address this?
Well, I don't think that I would make an overt appeal for the votes of evangelicals. I really haven't got a lot to show them. I'd say here are my positions, and you can make up your own mind. But you know, I have to have a strategy to win the New Hampshire primary, to win other states, and my strategy is to enlarge the electorate of those voting and have more millennials and more women, and I mean all women, not just moderate suburban women, after what they're trying to do on reproductive rights with these state statutes in the South and Midwest. It's totally unthinkable. And I think only in a Trump presidency would that idea even have gotten off the ground, much less carried into effect. So I think there's no answer to how I could persuade evangelicals to vote for me. If they've gone for Trump and made the Faustian bargain that they have, they're never going to vote for me. So I'm just simply going to be going after moderates, younger voters, minorities. I was elected with a rainbow coalition. Hispanics, blacks, gays and lesbians, you name it. I think I essentially was elected as a liberal in my first term. And then in the second term, everything went our way, so we won by a mile. But I did lose two towns, the two university towns, Cambridge and Amherst. And I think they had figured out that I wasn't quite as liberal as they thought I was. I won them both the first time and lost my hometown and Amherst the second time. But that's just because they didn't think I was spending enough money and I was balancing the damn budget. But we saved so much money. I had this brilliant top finance guy. His name is Charlie Baker. He's now the governor. And we privatized a whole lot of social services and put them out for bids by nonprofits. And there were all these 501c3s, that, particularly in the minority neighborhoods such as Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan in Massachusetts, who've been trying to deliver services to, quote, their people, quote, quote, for decades and couldn't get in, even under, you know, the sainted Michael Stanley Dukakis, the great liberal, because his constituency was the public employee unions, who were not my constituency. And the two things I was president of nationally when I was governor were U.S. term limits and the privatization council. So we put all this stuff out to bid in the private sector. The nonprofits won. They were much cheaper than the public sector. We closed all the big red brick warehouses that essentially look like prisons and put all the populations that were served, the mentally ill, the developmentally disabled, into halfway houses, no more than 11 to a house, with 4 staffers for 11 clients or residents, which is what we called them. They had been called inmates, believe it or not, under the prior regime with a great big red brick prison-like building. So we saved $300 million. And that sort of thing might also give you some money to apply to the great problem of income inequality.
Any other questions? Please come up to the center. Give your name. Here we go.
Hello, Governor Weld. Thank you for coming here. My name is Lou Walheim. I'm a resident here of Durham. I really appreciate your perspective as a Republican to try to move the Republican Party in the direction of doing something about climate change. And you gave some examples of Republican ideas that are in the works. But the problem seems to be that none of those Republicans are in office. And the ones that are in office, you mentioned the representative from Florida, I believe, who was almost front and center in that area. He was voted out.
I know.
Is there really any, So if none of them are being elected, people, the Republicans who believe these solutions, what hope is there for the Republican Party to actually come up and do something about this?
Well,
There's sort of this ideology issue where the environmental issues we're facing are very global, broad scale. Republicans believe in small government or individual freedom, and it's sort of this tension there that may be difficult to overcome. So that's why I appreciate your efforts at this.
Yeah, so I mean, I can show the way. I can't hold their hand while they vote, but I think if the Republicans in Washington don't change their ways, they're going to be slaughtered in the 2020 election. I went out to the annual convention of the NAACP in Detroit not long ago, and you know, everyone else said, "Oh, the president's a racist," and I said, "The president is an outrageous racist." This was right after the 4 Democratic women of color, the president attacking them for being black. You know, if they were driving a car, he'd have them arrested for driving while black. So I said the Republicans in Washington have a choice to make. They think it's a political choice, but it's not. It's a moral choice. And if they don't denounce the president in express terms for his outrageous racism, they're all going to be defeated at the polls next year. I've seen it happen before. I worked on the Nixon impeachment. I saw many honorable Republicans undergo the draining effort of defending him all summer long while he said, "I knew nothing about the Watergate break-in or any attempt to cover up the conspiracy. I knew nothing. Your president is not a crook." So then in in June or July, the tapes, the famous Watergate tapes become public, showing that this is an arrant lie, that he was directing the cover-up and the conspiracy from day one. Now Haldeman, now Ehrlichman, you go tell him this is national security. Tell him to get out of here. Get the FBI telling him this in the president's own voice. And I was present when this tape was played for Chuck Wiggins, who had led the defense of Nixon in the House Judiciary Committee, an eminent lawyer, later became a circuit judge. He burst into tears. And he's not that kind of guy. He's a solid, strong guy. He burst into tears because he could tell that he and all his people have been hung out to dry all summer long. And Donald Trump is hanging the Republicans out to dry in Washington, D.C., and he's going to take them with him. If you look at the fine points of his re-election plan, the political aspects to it, he's making no attempt to bring any suburban Republicans along with him. They can forget getting reelected. He loves that, though, because they're not his type of person. He wants only the extremists, and I think it's going to be a disaster for the Republican Party. I mean, I think you're going to see a Democratic U.S. Senate. And when the Republican U.S. senators wake up to that, there's going to be hell to pay. And they have already said to the president, if you don't stop this stuff, these hijinks, when we come back from recess, we're going to overrule you on these 5 or 6 things, which is why you see the president now tweeting every once in a while, such and such Republican senator does a great job. You know, Ben Sasse, who actually is an excellent senator from Nebraska, one of the few who stood up to the president at all. He tweeted yesterday morning, "Senator Sasse is really terrific. He gives you what you want, da 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 da." And he's just trying to, you know, kiss these Republicans so that they won't do to him what they've already, I think they've gotten the message that they got to take some action or they're all going to be gone.
Any other questions here? Come up to the center here so we can, and give your name.
I'm Sam Bourne. I'm Sam Bourne. I'm a 15-year-old from Ryan. My question is, when do we get carbon neutral by, and if not by 2030 as the UN predicts, then what? Because we've got to take drastic action.
I think the goal is net carbon neutrality, 0 emissions by 2050 in most of the analyses. But, you know, you got to start getting there right away, or else we're going to have a 3% increase and we will not have anything near neutrality. So we've got to make the down payment on that starting immediately. It's, as Jack Kennedy said when they said it would take 75 years to put a man on the moon, then we must start immediately. So it's got to start right away, but the year that we're aiming at is 2050. But you have to have milestones along the way.
But to beg the question, if not by 2030, the effects according to the UN are going to be basically irreversible. So 2050, how is 2050 even better if the effects by then are going to be irreversible?
I don't think, well, let me ask the experts here, but I don't think many people think we can get to net zero carbon emissions by 2030. That's essentially 10 years from now.
One of you or both of you like to
Yeah.
have a response?
Well, the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, they say we need to get down about 45% by 2030. So that's not net zero. Net zero is 2045 or so, 2050. But because we can't take 40% of our global emissions out in 1 year, we need to start now so we can drop it at a rapid pace, but achievable pace. If you put a price of $10 to $15 per ton of CO2 a year, every year, on the production of fossil fuels, it will drive emissions down close to that to meet the 2 degrees limit anyway. Then we're going to have to do some drops.
Thanks, John. I actually should have given this to our science person over here. Would you like to add anything, Roger?
Well, I think John hit it on the head. In referring to the IPCC. And with respect to a price on carbon, let's just remind ourselves we have a price on carbon here in New Hampshire. We're part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. When that first started, I think the clearing price for a ton of carbon was under $3. Today it's just shy of $6. It's around $5.50, I think, the clearance price in the last quarter. How many people in the room can feel that price in their pocketbooks? Raise your hand. That's what I thought.
Thank you both. Another question. Susan, you want?
Susan Richmond, I live here in Durham. Congress has the Energy Innovation and I think Dividend Act currently sort of banging around. What is it? Political numbers, political will? Why? Because so many people now are saying climate crisis, we need to do something. Here is this perfectly good act for carbon fee and dividend. Why is it not passing? What would you do to change it?
I'm sorry, that's sponsored by whom?
Mike, can you help me with that?
Probably John. You should be the person who.
Deutsche Mooney?
The whole lot of people.
Deutsche Mooney.
Deutsche Mooney. Yeah, it's in the house.
And how many people are endorsing it?
So there's 62 bipartisan endorsers, but Rooney's the Republican, the rest are Democrats. Citizens Climate Lobby developed the policy with economists, climate scientists, and politicians to do this bipartisan approach. And it's a matter of developing the political will across the country, people telling their Congress representatives that they want them to address the problem in a way that's fair and effective. And that's what this bill does. But it's a matter of convincing people that a carbon price is actually a good thing. This would return all of the money back to every household equally. So if you have an average carbon footprint, you'll break even because your higher prices will be average, and you get an average back because everybody gets the same equal share back in their dividend each month. The benefit of a dividend to everybody is that there's no means testing, it's very efficient to administer, there's no special paperwork. When everybody gets the dividend, it's fair to everybody, and if you are responsible for more than average carbon pollution, you will end up paying more each month. You can come out ahead, as most of the low-income households will, simply by having a lower than average carbon footprint. So you get the benefits of an efficient market driving emissions down, and it's fair, and the low-income households come out ahead.
But so why?
So actually, I'd like to have the politician here, who, the question was about how to do it, and I think maybe you might want to say something.
Well, the dividend to all households was in the Baker-Schultz plan, which is the granddaddy of all the Republican plans here. But I didn't quite hear you. How many of those 62 co-sponsors in the House are Republican? It's one. Okay, so that's the answer to the question. It's not truly bipartisan.
There will be a few more soon. We hope.
Well, you might not need so many after 2020.
Okay, so anybody else have questions here? We're already running past time, but I think some of the questions have been very good. Maybe one more. I see Brett. Or...
No, I was pointing to you.
Okay, Brett, would you like to say something? And say your full name.
Hi, Brett Gibson, a Durham resident as well. Very interested in economic factors, and it's supportive of the carbon fee in terms of leveling the playing field for renewable energy producers and companies. Do you have ideas about how to I don't know, I'd call it subsidizing, but supporting renewable energy alternatives as well as just leveling the playing field? So ideas there. And then also I'm interested in comparative analysis, other countries that have been successful, for example, like Scandinavia. A lot of the Scandinavian countries have just are banning combustible engines in their vehicles by 2024. I think Sweden just did this. And I'm starting to think of climate change as more of a social issue in terms of, instead of focusing on the individual, focusing on community.
Oh, yeah.
And so maybe if you could speak to that as well. We've been talking a lot about economic factors, but I thought that might be an interesting one to talk about as well.
A lot of things are becoming social issues that were never thought of as social issues. Guns is now a social issue. Climate change is a social issue. In terms of the politics going forward, I can't say it any better than I did before, that we got to get more bipartisan than we are now. The other part of your question?
Just in terms of renewable energy producers, what can we do? I mean, I think the carbon fee will level the playing field to some extent, but how can we also support?
You know, there's this huge, there has been this huge death match, Texas chainsaw death match between wind and solar, and arguing about who's going to get the bennies before the production tax credit expires or the solar incentives expire. I think we're now up against it. At the end of this year, we don't have the 2-year argument now anymore. We have a 1-year argument, right? So that issue is going to be joined in Congress in the next 12 months. I don't know. I mean, 5 years ago, I would have fought till the last dog died for every penny of subsidy for wind and solar, because they were kind of closer to being in their infancy. They've kind of got their sea legs now. And certainly by 2050, I'm not sure those subsidies are going to be as necessary as they are now. And part of the regulatory apparatus may also be able to be pruned, again, to get Republican votes. Although I will say the Trump administration gets credit for deregulation, and the only regulations they've cut are the protections for clean air and clean water, and then some in the financial area to protect low income and individuals in the event of a return of 2008. So every regulation they've rolled back was a good regulation. But let me ask the experts, do you have any wise ideas about how to support wind and solar? You don't really have to support hydro, I guess, at this point. In this part of the world, though, we've got it, and we're fortunate.
I think an argument can be made that a price on carbon will sort of attenuate the disparity between renewables and fossil fuels, but at the same time, to accelerate it, we are going to need to incentivize consumers in a way to help them make those choices. I know that the owner of Smutty Nose described the incentives that he received when he was building the brewery, helped him choose between a good technology for lighting and the best technology for lighting. So those incentives make a difference for businesses and consumers, and they help people make those choices, and those come right through the utilities. So it's not a government program, it is a market-based program through a regulated entity.
Your statement about giving credits to the lower income, the city of Dover has come to full agreement that it's the middle class that's disappearing. And you did not mention the upper class, that they get all these tax breaks that were permanent. So the city just passed last week, Wednesday, a tax credit of up to $30,000 for renewable energy. That it's that middle class that has the buying power to buy the solar panels to put on their homes. And the concern of those residents was that you have a house that's assessed at $200,000, now you're gonna put $30,000 worth of solar panels, so now their fear was that they were gonna be taxed at the next highest rate. And because solar energy is becoming very, very popular in this area, do you think there's something at the federal level, let me go back one step, that it won't be a cost to the city because of that break, because they'll have up until that $30,000 credit? So we know that the tax credits for the solar folks is going away. What can you do nationally that, Dover's very proud to be, we always say Dover first. And we don't know of any entity anywhere that has done this. And by all means, and by working with all the numbers, that middle class needs that incentive. So do you think anything can be done nationally to incentivize other homeowners or business owners with that possible tax credit?
Well, number one, I suppose the city could, in the municipal ordinance, direct the assessor not to jack these poor people into the next bracket. Beyond that, at the federal level, this is just a germ of an idea. But Reggie, for example, incentivizes people to enable them to make themselves carbon neutral. And a lot of people, myself included, pay more for electricity by checking the box on the bill from the utility that says, I want to be carbon neutral. When you take airplane flights now, you have the opportunity to pay an extra $16 to make your flight carbon neutral for you. And a lot of guilty liberals will pay that money, and maybe you could finance the relief for the middle class taxpayers that you're talking about that way as well at the municipal level. But that's a zero-sum game between the middle class taxpayers and the municipality. At the federal level, it would be some sort of federalized Reggie, I suppose, as close as I can come. But that's, as I say, only the germ of an idea.
But that's only, but the city of Dover is really tax neutral. If they're not paying more taxes because they can claim the credit in reverse. So it's not based on their assessment. So if you're going to encourage solar panels and renewable clean energy, in order to have these folks be able to come out and afford to purchase it, they need that extra dollars to be able to afford to do it, because there's just been some recent economics going out that within the city of Dover, there's 41% of our population makes over $70,000 a year, and 51% make under. So it's those folks, because of the new cost of living, rentals, mortgages, and everything, doesn't make it feasibly affordable. So that's why I said we got to think about the middle class too.
No, I get it, and it's a good question. And Mayor, I've written down your name and your office, and Ryan, my assistant in the back of the room, will make sure that we submit this question to our resident carbon pricing genius and see if we have something for you.
Okay, that would be great.
Well, I want to thank all of the people up here on the dais, especially Governor Weld. Another question, if you were over 25, I wouldn't let you ask a question. Come up here.
Together they are.
Here you go. Say your names.
Okay, I'm Evie Ashburner.
I'm Elise Walhan.
Okay, so we go to East River High Schools, and we both are in a program called VEEP.
It's called Vermont Energy Education Program, and
it's about students who are working to like create change in our schools and in our communities. And our school and we're very interested in single-use plastics and the waste that our school is producing. So we were just wondering, what are your views on like everyday things that we can do, like not using plastic straws to like make change?
Yeah, we went to the, we testified at a hearing about a ban on single-use plastic straws and bags, and it didn't pass, and we were just wondering like what you would do, if anything, if you get elected.
Well, reducing the use of, that citizens can do in the street without any loss. Reducing the use of plastics is a good one. Making your views known that we don't need a zillion pounds of packaging around everything we buy. I mean, my laundry drives me absolutely crazy with the amount of packaging that goes around the clothes that come back from the laundry. In the summer, if you pass stores that have their doors open to invite customers in because of all the marvelous air conditioning inside, that's not quite so much a threat in New Hampshire as it is in New York City, where all the shops on Madison Avenue have their doors wide open, and these freezing temperatures inside, and the amount of energy escaping into the 90-degree heat out in the street is a complete scandal. I know environmental folks in New York City, this is their number one complaint. But just that sort of daily example is something that people can just speak up about, and if enough people do that, that will influence behavior.
Well, I'll start over again for the end. I want to thank everyone for being here, the whole audience, all members of the panel, Governor Weld, his staff, and I really appreciate Governor Weld's concern about the climate. And I want to mention to people that our series of candidate climate forums will continue, but it's going to take vacation for the month of October. In November, we'll be here again recruiting candidates to appear. If you did get an email about this, please find that clipboard, whatever it is, and sign up so you can get notification when the next candidate climate forum occurs. Did you want to say anything more? If not, we're done.
Okay.
Thank you all.